When we talk about properties of numbers, there are a lot of things that allow us to do the things we do in math. And we just need to make a list here, and I will give you some examples. We've got to cover these first, then I'll show you what we're going to do with them in our assignment. The first property is the reflexive property. Think reflection in the mirror. It says that 5 equals 5. All right, sounds like pretty much common sense. Let's move on. Then you have the symmetric property. If something is symmetric, it means its left and right are the same. So if A equals 5, then 5 equals A. For example, that would be the symmetric property. Okay? The transitive property. Transitive, you think across. All right? Trans means you go across. So here's what the transitive property says. If A equals B, and B equals C, then what do you think has to be true? Then A has to equal C. And the reason I said across is think of this. Going across. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. All right? Just kind of thinking through common sense. If, for example, if X equals 7 and Y equals 7, for example, then X has to be equal to Y. Has to. All right, that would be an example of the transitive property. Okay. Now, the next one we use a lot. We use it all the time. It's called the substitution property. And all you need to think about in the substitution property is you are replacing something. You know these order of operations problems we've been doing? Let's say that I have 3 plus 7 in parentheses plus 5, something like that. We do what's in parentheses first, right? And 3 plus 7 is 10. So the fact that I can replace the 3 plus 7 with a 10, that is the substitution property. The substitution property says I can replace the 3 plus 7 with a 10. You just didn't know there was a property that said we could do that. Okay? Next, let's get through our list here. The next one is common sense. But this common sense has a name, and it's called the additive identity. Additive identity. What is the number that I can add to any number that will not change? 0. 0 is the additive identity. You just put a little arrow and you can put 0. The additive identity says that 6 plus 0 is still 6. That's what the additive identity property says. Now, if I add the opposite of a number to itself, I get the additive identity. Show you what I mean. That property is called the additive inverse property. Let's take the number 13. If I add the opposite of 13 to that, what's the opposite of 13? Negative 13. If I add negative 13 to that, I get 0, which is the additive identity. Okay, so the additive inverse property says that if I add the opposite of a number to itself, I get 0, or I get what's called the additive identity. All right? Now, there's also this same kind of relationship, okay? There's this same kind of relationship for multiplication. There is here's a big word, multiplicative identity. Multiplicative. The multiplicative identity, what's the number that I can multiply any number by that won't change it? 1. 17 times 1 is 17. Okay. Now, there's also a multiplicative inverse. This one maybe requires a little bit more thought. 17 times something will equal 1. We have to think fraction here. I've taught you about factoring with fractions. Watch this. If I multiply this by 1/17, don't I get 1? That's what the multiplicative inverse property says. 17 times 1/17 is 1. All right? How about, let's just abbreviate for multiplicative this time. Multiplicative property of 0. The multiplicative property of 0 says that if you multiply a number by 0, you get 0. 8 times 0 is 0. Now we have two big properties to finish with. The commutative property. Boy, this one's important. The commutative property, commutative, and I'd like for you to write off to the side, order doesn't matter. Order doesn't matter for two operations. Which two operations? Think add, subtract, multiply, divide. Which one of those two does order not matter? Multiply. We can multiply in any order, and we can add in any order. So the commutative property is true for addition because 5 plus 3 is the same thing as 3 plus 5. And the commutative property is also true for multiplication because 5 times 3 is the same thing as 3 times 5. It is not true for subtraction and division. Think about it. 12 divided by 4 is not the same thing as 4 divided by 12. The left side is 3, the right side is 1/3. They're not the same. All right, the commutative property is not true for division. It's also not true for subtraction, which I think is more obvious. The last property is the associative property. And with the associative property, we're talking about the way we associate or group things together. Here's what it's saying. I think you all would agree with this statement. 3 plus 4 plus 5 equals 3 plus 4 plus 5. If it's all addition like that, the associative property says that if I put parentheses around 3 plus 4 on the left, and on the right I put it around 4 plus 5, I get the same answer. On the left you have 7 plus 5, which is 12, and on the right you have 3 plus 9, which is 12. It's also true for multiplication. If I had 3 times 4 times 5, on the left, if I group the 3 and the 4, on the right, I group the 4 and the 5, I'll get the same thing. That's called the associative property. Now, what we have to do in homework is look at problem situations and try to state when we are using a property. And so you will want to have your properties close by. They're going to tell you to evaluate and name the property used on each step. Evaluate and name the property used on each step. So, let's say that we have something like this. Call this number 1. So there's our problem. 7 times in parentheses 4 minus 3 minus 1 plus 5 times 1/5. Doing order of operations, don't I need to do the 4 minus 3 first? What's 4 minus 3? 1. Okay, stop for a second. What property says I can replace 4 minus 3 with 1? Isn't it the substitution property? So the fact that I could go from here to here is the substitution property. And you need to make a note of that someplace, either off to the side or below. I'll put it below. And I really don't care if you abbreviate. I know there could be a lot of writing on this. You can just put sub if you want for substitution. Let's keep going with the problem. Minus 1 plus 5 times 1/5. That 5 times 1/5 looks familiar. We learned a property about that today, didn't we? 5 times 1/5 is 1. Which property says that 5 times 1/5 is 1? Multiplicative inverse. So now this thing becomes 1, and what's said that I could do that is the multiplicative inverse property. You can abbreviate like I did. Now what's 7 times 1? What property says I can replace 7 times 1 with 7? Isn't it the substitution? Or it could be two properties. Couldn't it be the multiplicative identity, Tanner?
Yep.
The multiplicative identity property. Or it could be substitution. So now I've got 7 minus 1 plus 1. The rest of the way, isn't it going to be substitution? 7 minus 1 is 6. 6 plus 1 is 7, and so on. And of course, 6 plus 1 is 7. Both of these are the substitution property. So tonight, what you're going to be doing is working out a problem, but then you're going to have your list of properties beside you, and you are going to write down the properties you used, and don't be afraid of being wrong, okay? Just make an attempt and try to match up what you did. Look at the examples I gave you for each property, and we will stop there for today.